See, buckthorn oil didn't become valuable because it promised results. It became valuable because it survived conditions most plants never could. For centuries, this plant grew where soil offered little, winters were brutal, and survival depended on adaptation, not perfection. It wasn't shaped to be gentle. It was shaped to endure. And when the modern world finally noticed it, something had to change, not in the plant, but in the systems that tried to control it. See, buckthorn oil does not begin in laboratories, in carefully controlled environments, or in places designed for comfort. Its story begins in regions where survival itself is uncertain, where the land offers very little, and where most plants simply fail to remain alive. These are landscapes shaped by long winters, strong winds, poor soil, and constant environmental pressure, places where growth is slow, irregular, and never guaranteed. In these environments, nothing grows by accident. Every plant that survives does so because it adapts continuously, season after season, under conditions that allow no margin for error. The soil is often dry or eroded, stripped of nutrients by wind and time. Temperatures fluctuate sharply, creating cycles of freezing and thawing that stress roots, stems, and internal systems alike. Water is inconsistent, sunlight is limited for long periods, and the growing season is short enough that any delay can mean failure. See, buckthorn learned to exist within these constraints long before it was ever noticed by humans. It did not grow in abundance. It did not spread effortlessly. It persisted slowly, adjusting its internal processes to survive where comfort was never an option. Each year of survival depended on efficiency, not expansion. Energy could not be wasted. Resources had to be conserved, stored, and redistributed carefully over time. What matters here is not the oil itself, but the pressure that shaped the plant. Pressure is not a single event. It is cumulative. It builds across years, decades, and generations, gradually forcing biological systems to reorganize themselves in response to constant stress. In C. buckthorn's case, this meant developing structures capable of enduring cold, resisting dehydration, and protecting internal components from environmental damage. Unlike plants that evolve in stable environments, C. buckthorn did not rely on predictability. Stability was never guaranteed. Instead, the plant adapted to uncertainty. Its growth patterns became compact rather than expansive. Its internal composition became dense rather than diluted. Protective mechanisms developed not as enhancements, but as necessities required to endure repeated environmental shocks. For centuries, these adaptations remained invisible. See, buckthorn existed quietly within ecosystems that humans rarely visited and rarely valued. There were no markets demanding uniformity, no global systems expecting consistency, no pressure to perform on schedule. The plant grew, survived, and reproduced within the limits imposed by its surroundings, unconcerned with efficiency as defined by modern standards. In these regions, survival is never about optimization. It is about endurance. Plants that attempt to grow quickly often fail. Those that rely on excess resources disappear. Only systems capable of operating with minimal input persist. See, buckthorn became one of those systems, shaped not by abundance, but by scarcity. This context matters because it explains everything that follows. The characteristics that later attracted attention were not created to impress, nourish, or heal. They were created to endure. What modern language might describe as strength or richness was, in its original context, simply what allowed the plant to return each season. The environment did not reward beauty. It rewarded resilience. It did not reward speed. It rewarded efficiency, and it did not tolerate weakness. See, buckthorn learned these rules slowly, under pressure that never paused and never negotiated. Long before it was called valuable, rare, or powerful, C. buckthorn was simply one of the few plants capable of surviving where life itself seemed unlikely. And that reality, more than any later interpretation, is the true beginning of its story. C. buckthorn did not adapt because adaptation was beneficial. It adapted because failure was not an option. In environments defined by scarcity and instability, every biological system is forced to reorganize itself continuously in response to pressure that never fully disappears. Adaptation here is not innovation. It is survival under constraint. Over long periods of time, C. buckthorn learned how to operate with minimal margin for error. Growth cycles became tightly regulated, responding directly to temperature shifts, water availability, and soil conditions that could change dramatically from one season to the next. There was no room for excess expansion, no tolerance for inefficiency. Any internal process that consumed more energy than it returned eventually disappeared. This gradual restructuring did not happen in a single generation. It accumulated slowly, as plants that failed to manage resources efficiently were removed from the system. while those capable of conserving, protecting, and redistributing energy survived. What remained was not a stronger plant in the abstract sense, but a more disciplined biological system shaped by repeated exposure to limitation. Internally, C. buckthorn shifted toward concentration rather than dispersion. Instead of spreading resources thinly, the plant learned to store and protect what it could gather. Structural density increased as a form of insurance against environmental shock. Protective mechanisms developed not to enhance performance, but to reduce vulnerability. Each adjustment reduced risk at the cost of flexibility, creating a system optimized for endurance rather than speed. The berries themselves reflect this process. Their development favors protection over abundance. Thick skins form as a barrier against cold, wind, and dehydration. Internal structures become compact, designed to preserve integrity under repeated stress. These characteristics are not aesthetic decisions. They are biological responses to environments that punish fragility. Timing also became critical. In regions with short growing seasons, delays can be fatal. C. buckthorn adapted by synchronizing internal processes closely with environmental cues. Growth, flowering, and resource allocation occur within narrow windows dictated by climate rather than opportunity. The plant does not wait for ideal conditions. It responds immediately to what is available, knowing that those conditions may not last. Over time, this created a system that appears resilient but is actually cautious. Every process is measured. Every response is controlled. There is little excess, little waste, and little tolerance for unpredictability. What looks like strength is, in reality, restraint developed under pressure. These adaptations were never designed to be stable across environments. They were specific responses to specific conditions. Remove the pressure, and the system behaves differently. Change the environment, and the plant's internal priorities shift. Adaptation, in this sense, is not an intrinsic trait. It is a relationship with context. For centuries, this relationship remained intact. C. buckthorn existed within the boundaries imposed by its surroundings, adapting continuously without external interference. There was no incentive to accelerate growth, no requirement to produce uniform outcomes, and no demand to behave consistently across regions. Variation was normal, expected, and accepted. This is an important distinction. Adaptation in nature does not aim for standardization. It aims for survival within constraints. Uniformity is not a goal. Responsiveness is. C. buckthorn's internal systems reflect this principle, having evolved to respond to stress rather than eliminate it. When humans later encountered these adaptations, they interpreted them through a different lens. Density became richness. Protection became strength. Restraint became value. But these interpretations ignore the original context in which these traits formed. C. buckthorn did not adapt to serve human needs. It adapted to remain alive under constant pressure. Its internal systems are records of environmental stress accumulated over time, not deliberate enhancements designed for consumption or use. Understanding this distinction matters because it explains why later interventions would create tension. Systems shaped by variability resist standardization. Processes developed under pressure behave differently when that pressure is removed or altered. What worked within extreme environments does not automatically translate into controlled systems without consequence. This sets the stage for what comes next. When the modern world began to notice C. buckthorn, it did not encounter a neutral ingredient. It encountered a system shaped by limits, scarcity, and constant adjustment. And once that system entered environments defined by scale, consistency, and control, something had to change. At some point, C. buckthorn stopped being understood as a plant shaped by constraint and started being described as a solution shaped by intention. This shift did not happen because the oil changed. It happened because the lens through which it was viewed changed. What once existed as a response to environmental pressure was reframed as intrinsic value. Density became richness. Protection became potency. Survival mechanisms were reinterpreted as features. The context that produced them slowly faded from the narrative. This is how stories begin to detach from systems. As interest grew, explanations became simpler. Complex adaptations were reduced to attractive summaries. The long relationship between the plant and its environment was compressed into a few digestible ideas that could travel faster than reality ever could. The oil did not ask for this transformation. But once language enters a system, it begins to reorganize perception. What people believe something is for starts to matter more than what it was shaped to endure. This is the moment where the original logic begins to weaken, not because it disappears, but because it becomes inconvenient. Scale does not negotiate with nuance. It demands repetition, predictability, and output that behaves the same way every time. When C. Buckthorn entered scaled systems, its original strengths became liabilities. Variability disrupted planning. Seasonality interfered with scheduling. Regional differences complicated consistency. The plant had adapted to stress. The system it entered could not tolerate it. So adjustments began, not to improve the oil, but to stabilize it. Processes were introduced to smooth variation. Time was compressed. Output was normalized. What could not be controlled was removed or reduced. This is not corruption. This is translation between incompatible systems. The oil that once responded to environmental pressure now had to respond to industrial timelines. And when that happens, something fundamental shifts, not visibly, but structurally. What had to be removed? Every system that scales removes friction. In natural systems, friction is where adaptation lives. To make C. Buckthorn reliable, parts of its original behavior had to be quieted. Irregularities were minimized. Protective mechanisms were altered. Responses that once existed to handle stress were no longer necessary, or were seen as inefficiencies. The oil did not disappear, but the conditions that shaped its internal logic did. What remains still carries the name, the color, and the story. But internally, the priorities are different. The system is no longer optimized for endurance under pressure. It is optimized for predictability under control. This is the invisible trade that never appears on labels. Why nothing went wrong? It's important to understand, nothing here failed. C. Buckthorn oil did not lose value because of mistakes or deception. It changed because it entered a system with different rules. Nature rewards responsiveness. Industry rewards stability. These incentives do not align, and never have. Once this oil became part of global systems, it could no longer behave as it once did. Expecting otherwise is misunderstanding how systems work. The problem was never quality. The problem was translation. The illusion of improvement. From the outside, everything looks better. Supply is stable. Availability is constant. Products look uniform. The oil behaves the same way across regions and seasons. But improvement depends on what you value. If the goal is consistency, the system succeeded. If the goal is preserving adaptation shaped by pressure, something else was lost. This loss is not dramatic. It is quiet. And because it does not announce itself, most people never notice. Why this pattern repeats? C. Buckthorn is not unique. This same transformation happens to every ingredient that moves from constrained environments into scalable systems. The pattern repeats because the incentives never change. Systems that prioritize growth cannot preserve behaviors shaped by limits. They can only simulate them. Once you see this pattern, it becomes difficult to unsee. Ingredients stop looking like miracles and start looking like outcomes of systems colliding. C. Buckthorn oil was never powerful because of what it promised. It was shaped by what it endured. What you encounter today is not a worse version, just a different one, adapted to a world that no longer tolerates variability. Understanding this does not require rejection. It requires clarity. The oil didn't change first. The system did. And once systems change, ingredients follow, quietly, without permission, and without asking whether they should. If this story shifted how you see ingredients, the next one will go even deeper. Because this pattern doesn't stop here.